Hello and welcome to the first video in our series on income inequality. In this video, I'll discuss some economic concepts related to the income inequality gap and provide a snapshot of our national and provincial status using the latest data from the OECD and Statistics Canada. Income inequality is a relative degree of inequality in the distribution of income among a population. It's the gap between the richest people having the highest incomes and the poorest people having the lowest incomes. One way of measuring the income inequality gap is using the Gini coefficient, which is a calculated value based on income distribution that ranges from 0 to 1. For this discussion, what's important to know is that a Gini value of 1 represents perfect inequality, meaning only one person has all the income, and a Gini value of 0 represents perfect equality, meaning everyone receives the same amount of income. While perfect equality and perfect inequality are pretty much impossible, Gini values approaching 1 are important because they signal a very wide gap between the incomes of the rich and the poor. Gini values closer to 0, on the other hand, represent a tighter gap, meaning incomes between the rich and the poor really aren't that far apart. For reference, as the next few charts will show, the Gini coefficient for most countries tends to fall somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5. Two considerations when looking at the income inequality gap are: one, how the gap varies across geographic regions. So for example, looking back to 1985 Gini levels, Sweden had a relatively small gap at 0.20, whereas Mexico, at the other end of the spectrum, had a relatively larger gap at 0.45, more than 2 times that of Sweden. A second way of looking at the income inequality gap is to observe how the shape of the gap changes over time. So, when you look at a region's gap over a period of time, say from 1985 to 2012, the Gini has notably risen for most countries. Referring back to Sweden, the gap has gone up from 0.20 in 1985 to 0.27 in 2012. The gap for Turkey, on the other hand, has gone down from 0.43 in 1985 to 0.40 in 2012. Another interesting observation is that we're seeing an indication over the last 25 years or so that Gini levels may be beginning to flatten out. That is, more countries with lower values are shifting upward rather than countries with higher values shifting substantially downward. Effectively, the linear trend is pivoting upward, so it's not as steep in 2012 as it was in 1985. So why is it important to look at income inequality? From a policy perspective, the International Monetary Fund, whose organizational goals include the promotion of high employment and sustainable economic growth and poverty reduction around the world, they suggest that sustained and/or growing income inequality is associated with high social costs, which can negatively impact educational and occupational choices, economic, financial, and political instability, which can slow economic growth by dampening investment, and also the hindrance of poverty reduction. That is, in order to align policy decisions with good governance, it's important to look at income inequality for both economic and social reasons. From a national and provincial lens, this chart with the provinces displayed from east to west shows how the income gaps compare to and across the Canadian 5-year average for the 2009 to 2013 period. So here we can see that BC, Alberta, and Ontario are slightly above Canada's 0.32 Gini, with all the other provinces below. And in this chart, which highlights the highest and lowest average for the 2009-2013 period, Ontario has the highest Gini average at 0.32, and Prince Edward Island has the lowest Gini average at 0.27. In comparison, Newfoundland and Labrador is in between the high and the low at 0.305. That is 0.016 lower than Ontario, but 0.027 higher than Prince Edward Island. Looking back over a 30-year period, the 5-year Gini average has increased for all provinces except for New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. In this chart, which plots the Gini coefficient over time, you can see that the gap for Newfoundland and Labrador has maintained a relatively low profile. Adding in the gap for Canada, you can see the trend really doesn't deviate much. Between 1976 and 1985, the Gini is relatively flat for both Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador, at which point they both drop a little, Newfoundland and Labrador a little bit more than Canada, but they both begin to rise again after 1989, and then kind of flatten out again after 2000. Except for a few anomalies characterized by little peaks and troughs, Newfoundland and Labrador has remained marginally lower than Canada from about 1986 onwards. While it's good in the sense that the gap is not increasing, the relatively flat Gini trend means income inequality has not changed substantially over the last 25 years. It's also interesting to note the trend closely tracks Canada. So just to recap, income inequality is the gap between the richest people having the highest incomes and the poorest people having the lowest incomes. A wider gap with Gini values closer to 1 means incomes between the rich and the poor are far apart, while a tighter gap with Gini values closer to 0 means incomes between the rich and the poor don't vary that much. An important aspect of studying this gap from a national and provincial perspective is to have a closer look at how it impacts social costs, such as access to health and education services, economic, financial, and political instability, and poverty reduction. Upon reviewing the data, analysis suggests our income inequality gap over the last 35 years has been relatively sustained, which is a signal that the provinces should look for ways of closing the gap, that is, lowering the Gini value, by lowering social costs, encouraging investment, and reducing poverty. So this concludes the first video in our series on income inequality. In the next video, I'll take a look at wage income data, specifically how it has increased over the past 25 years in Newfoundland and Labrador, and how it compares to the rest of Atlantic Canada and Canada. Thank you for watching.